The silence in the living room was heavy, a thick shroud that seemed to absorb the very air Elena breathed. She sat on a worn velvet sofa, watching the long shadows dance against the walls as the sun set. Around her, the skeleton of a life once shared lay scattered in empty cardboard boxes, taped shut and labeled with the cold efficiency of a woman preparing for a funeral. Her gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, where a single silver frame remained. The glass was spiderwebbed with cracks, a jagged fracture running right through the center of the image, where she and Marco once stood on their wedding day, radiant and certain of a forever that now felt like a cruel joke. Every corner of the house whispered of what had been lost, making the dim light feel even more oppressive. It had been 3 weeks since the night the world fractured. The memories felt like a fever dream she could not break. She could still hear the echo of Marco's voice, sharp and laced with a pride that refused to bend. There were secrets, or so he thought, small omissions that had ballooned into monstrous lies in his mind. A devastating misunderstanding had become the wall neither of them could climb. That night, words were like shards of glass, cutting deep into the fabric of their 5-year history. Elena had watched him pack a suitcase, his face a mask of cold indifference that hid the same agony she felt. When the front door clicked shut, the sound vibrated in her very marrow. A physical ache settled in her chest as they drifted toward a final divorce. Part of her, the wounded ego that screamed for justice, wanted to stay angry. It wanted to nurse the resentment until it became a shield. Yet deeper down, her soul yearned for the man she had once known. She missed his laughter and the quiet, steady comfort of his presence in the early morning. She was caught in a brutal tug-of-war between the desire to be right and the desperate need to be loved. The thought of a life without him was a void she was not prepared to cross, regardless of the anger that simmered on the surface. In an attempt to distract herself, Elena began to sift through a drawer of old keepsakes. Hidden beneath a stack of letters, her fingers brushed against something small and laminated. She pulled it out, and the sight brought a sudden sting of tears. It was an ancient prayer card of St. Raphael the Archangel, passed down from her grandmother. It was a relic of a woman who believed no wound was too deep for the medicine of God to heal. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elena remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell about the journey of Tobias. She spoke of how the Archangel Raphael had guided the young man through treacherous lands to heal his family and find his wife. If Raphael could guide Tobias through the wilderness, perhaps he could guide her through the wreckage of her own heart. She decided then, with a trembling hand, to embark on a spiritual journey of healing. It was a gamble of faith against an overwhelming tide of doubt. She cleared a small space on the table, placing the prayer card in the center. She struck a match, the flame flickering as it caught the wick of a white candle. The scent of beeswax filled the air, a soft light pushing back the shadows. As she whispered the first words of the restoration prayer, her voice felt thin. She pleaded for a miracle, for the scales to fall from their eyes. Just as the warmth of the prayer settled in her heart, the ring of her phone shattered the stillness. The caller ID flashed a name she hadn't seen in 14 days. Marco. Her heart hammered as she pressed the phone to her ear. Marco, she breathed. On the other end, there was a sharp intake of breath, a ghost of a word, and then nothing. The line went dead, leaving her in a silence far more chilling than before. The disconnected call haunted the following days like a lingering cold that would not break. Eleanor checked her phone every few minutes, the screen a tombstone of unread messages. Over the next few days, she faced what the saints called the silence of God. Marco had vanished into a fortress of his own making, refusing to answer any follow-up messages or return her desperate calls. She sat in the quiet of the living room, the flickering candle casting shadows that seemed to mock her devotion. Each hour without a word felt like stone piled upon her chest, threatening to crush the fragile hope she had so carefully nurtured. Within the stillness, a fierce internal conflict began to rage. Elena's mind became a battlefield where faith and logic fought for dominance. She wondered if she prayed for a miracle or chased a vanished ghost. The temptation to give up was a physical weight, whispering that it would be easier to let go and sink into the numbness of the inevitable. She struggled with the feeling that her prayers were bouncing off the ceiling, unheard and unregarded by the heavens. Was she a fool to believe that an ancient archangel cared about the wreckage of a modern suburban home? Yet she persisted, turning her focus toward the spiritual significance of Saint Raphael. She delved into the texts that described him as the medicine of God, a title that resonated deeply within her own fractured spirit. Elena began to realize that the restoration she sought wasn't just about a change in Marco's location, but a healing of the blindness that had gripped them both. She prayed specifically for the scales to fall from Marco's eyes and for the softening of her own hardened heart. She saw that her pride had been a catalyst, a spiritual cataract that prevented her from seeing his pain through the fog of her own. This was surgery of the soul, and surgery was never painless. The shadow of the enemy loomed large as external pressures mounted. The phone rang often, but rarely with the voice she craved. Lawyers began calling with increasing frequency, their voices sharp and professional as they pushed for her signature on the final separation papers. Mutual friends, well-meaning but misguided, pressured Elena to stop the nonsense and move on. They spoke of closure and new beginnings, unaware of her spiritual fight. Each legal document felt like jagged glass, a manifestation of the world's desire to see her covenant torn apart. Miles away, in a sterile hotel room that smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee, Marco sat in the dark. He watched the same moon Elena did, feeling a strange, inexplicable pull toward the home he had abandoned. He was paralyzed by a toxic mixture of pride and shame, convinced that the words he had shouted could never be unsaid. He looked at his phone, his thumb hovering over her name, but his ego acted as a leaden weight on his spirit. He was a man lost in a wilderness of his own creation, feeling the warmth of a prayer he didn't know was being said, yet still too afraid to take the first step back toward the light. In a final act of humility, Eleanor drove to the church where they had exchanged their vows. The air inside was cool and heavy with the scent of old wood. She didn't ask for a sign. Instead, she left a letter of total forgiveness tucked near the statue of Saint Raphael, a symbolic act of penance and surrender. As she walked out, the progress of grace became visible. She found a single white feather on the doorstep, and that evening, her empty house was suddenly filled with the sweet, unmistakable scent of incense. Finally, a letter arrived, not from Marco, but from an anonymous third party. It was a confession that revealed the hidden truth behind the misunderstanding that had torn their lives apart. The 9th day arrived with an expectant stillness. Elena knelt on the floor, her knees aching from days of supplication, but her spirit was lighter than it had been in years. She no longer prayed for a specific result or begged for the lawyers to stop their persistent calls. Instead, she surrendered the entire outcome to the divine, offering up her marriage as a broken vessel for Saint Raphael to mend as he saw fit. Her voice was a steady, rhythmic hum in the dim room. Medicine of God, heal what I cannot see. Guide us to the truth, even if that truth leads us apart. The candle flame no longer flickered. It stood tall and bright, a pillar of gold in the center of her small altar. This was the climax of her journey, a moment of absolute faith where her ego had finally been burned away, leaving only a raw, honest hope. Outside, the sky bruised into a deep purple before erupting into a violent rainstorm. Thunder shook the window panes, and the sound of water lashing against the roof became a rhythmic chant. In the midst of this deluge, she heard a hesitant, heavy knock at the door. Elena froze, her heart leaping against her ribs. When she opened the door, she found Marco. He was soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to his shivering frame, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and something far deeper. He looked broken, stripped of his pride. There was no anger in him. Before she could speak, he sank to his knees on the mat as the rain poured off the eaves of the house. He looked up at her and whispered the one thing his pride had never allowed him to say. "Please, Elena, forgive me." "Adil!" Elena reached down, her tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks, and pulled him inside. As the storm continued to rage, a different kind of peace settled within the walls. She showed him the letter from the third party, the simple, devastating misunderstanding that had ignited their final argument. As Marco read the words, his tension snapped. It was as if the scales were falling from his eyes, a modern-day reflection of the healing of Tobit's father. They realized how easily they had been blinded by their own shadows, and how a series of small, uncorrected errors had been twisted into a mountain of resentment. The medicine of God had worked its slow, meticulous magic, stripping away the infection of doubt until only the healthy tissue of their shared love remained. The reconciliation was a quiet, tearful weaving back together of two lives. They sat on the floor, surrounded by the unpacked boxes that had once signaled the end of their story, and acknowledged the invisible hand that had guided them back to this point. They spoke of the strange pulls they had felt, the sense of incense, and the sudden moments of peace that had defied the logic of their situation. Together, they reached for the ancient prayer card of Saint Raphael. They prayed as one, their voices interlocking as they consecrated their renewed relationship to the Archangel of Healing. They promised to protect this second chance, to never let pride build another wall between them, and to always seek the light when the shadows began to grow long. To anyone watching this, whose heart is currently heavy with the weight of a fractured bond, know that no relationship is ever too broken for the divine to repair. If there is even a single spark of faith and a heart willing to set aside its pride, the medicine of God can find a way through the most impenetrable darkness. Restoration is not always easy, and it rarely happens on our timeline, but it is possible for those who are brave enough to ask for guidance. Elena looked over at the wedding photo on the table. The glass was still cracked, but the picture inside was vibrant and clear. As she turned to follow Marco into the kitchen, she caught a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of the room. It was vast and shimmering, shaped like a pair of magnificent wings, before it gently dissolved into the soft morning light.